Good day. Today is Saturday, 19th October, and we still have not had a strike by Israel against Iran. In fact, from the time shortly after I finished my making my video yesterday, but before it was published, a whole cluster of articles started to appear in all sorts of places across mainstream media, including in surprising places like the Daily Telegraph and the Guardian, all suggesting that Israel, following the death of Yahya Sinwar, take the win, as it is put, and treat this as an off-ramp to extricate itself from the various wars. Well, for every such article, I have to say, suggesting that Israel seek an off-ramp at this point, or treat the death of Sinwar as offering an off-ramp. There are about 5 which counsel Israel to do the exact opposite, to redouble its wars in Gaza, in Lebanon, against Iran, and all the indications are that that is the line that it is going to pursue over the next couple of days and weeks. In fact, there's been a long article in Reuters which says that Israeli sources are saying that Israel, with the death of Sinwar, once again feels itself to be on a roll, that it's going to go on fighting until it's able to carve out buffer zones in northern Gaza and in southern Lebanon, and that this is Israel's opportunity to do that, and that Israel wants that process completed in some form before the new president of the United States takes office in January, so as to create what the Israelis have called and have called for decades when applied to places like the West Bank, for example, facts on the ground, facts which the Israelis say, once they're established, cannot be changed. There are also hints in this same Reuters article that Israel is going to press forward eventually with its strike against Iran. So this is what all of these articles have been saying, and this is what the latest reports from Israel are also saying. And for the record, there's also a report which I've just seen, it's literally just come up as I've started making this video, that Prime Minister Netanyahu is again calling for further military action, an escalation of military action, and the event which has caused him to say that is that there has apparently been a Hezbollah drone strike on his house. Well, I'm not going to discuss that further. As I said, it's a topic I will have to discuss in my program tomorrow. So all the indications are that the Israelis are not going to do what I suggested yesterday and what others are advising Israel to do. Instead, Israel is going to forge ahead, pursue its various wars. The Reuters article even admitted that this was a war that Israel is now fighting on multiple fronts, but instead of this being something which one would have thought would be reason for pause, it seems on the part of some people to be reason for encouragement. Anyway, they're going to press on, which means we will have more war, we will have more devastation, many more people are going to die, there will be more deaths in Gaza, more deaths in Lebanon, more anger, and as I said, the death of Sinwar, as I said yesterday, the death of Sinwar will seem like a punctuation mark in this evolving tragic story. Now, to add to a point I have made previously, about Israel establishing buffer zones in southern Lebanon and in northern Gaza. It's incredible to me that memories are so short. Isn't that exactly what Israel tried to do in southern Lebanon before? It didn't succeed. On the contrary, it provided the Lebanese a cause to rally against, especially the Shia Lebanese. Hezbollah ultimately emerged out of that attempt, that previous attempt by Israel to carve out a buffer zone in southern Lebanon. Israeli soldiers were killed. Fighting sometimes spilled over into Israel itself. Eventually, Israel was obliged to withdraw. I see absolutely no reason, no factor at all in the situation today that suggests that an attempt to do the same thing this time would be any more successful. That is, assuming, of course, that that sort of buffer zone can be established in southern Lebanon at all. On the contrary, with a growing shift in the global balance of power, which we are seeing and which has been spoken about by various important people just today, I would have thought that Israel's prospects of successfully establishing a buffer zone in southern Lebanon are significantly less than they were in the 1980s and 1990s, when, to say it straightforwardly, the United States and the Western powers, the main allies of Israel, in other words, were far and away the most dominant force in global affairs. If that didn't succeed then, in those extremely auspicious geopolitical conditions, how is it likely to succeed now? But Prime Minister Netanyahu, the people around him, the members of his cabinet, men like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, they're determined to press forward. And well, the outcome, I'm sure, will be exactly as I have said, and exactly, by the way, as lots of other people are saying. But one of the remarkable things, one of the remarkable facts about Western policy, and in this respect, in this regard, Israel is, of course, itself a part of the West, and what is justified when talking about Israeli policy, about talking about Western policy. One of the remarkable things about Western policy is that the same mistakes are endlessly repeated because no lessons are ever learned. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the Middle East situation for the moment. It could be that at some point over the next few hours or days, the Israeli strike on Iran will take place. A couple of days ago, it was reported that Israel was ready to carry out that strike. All that was needed was for the order to be given. Why that order has not been given, whether it is connected to internal Israeli discussions, whether there are still worries as to what Iran might do or as to what the Russians might do in light of the Iranian missile strike of 1st October. Well, I've discussed that all at exhaustive length, and I have really nothing further to say. We shall see when the Israeli strike comes. I'm confident that some kind of strike or action by Israel against Iran will happen. We'll see what it is. We will see how effective or successful it turns out to be. And then, of course, it will shift back. The story, it will shift back to us all wondering about the potential Iranian reaction. Anyway, there it is. That is the situation as of today in the Middle East, so far as I can see. Now, before I turn to the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine, I'm going to say that We are now in the closing stages before the BRICS summit, which is taking place in Kazan in, I think, just over 10 days, just under 10 days' time. And President Putin has given a massive press conference to journalists from the various BRICS states, including, importantly and interestingly, a journalist from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia confirmed that it will participate in the BRICS summit. There were some doubts, but it seems that it will do so. MBS himself, however, is not going, which some people will interpret as a hedge or a qualifier. The explanation that's been provided, and I think for what it's worth, by the way, it's a perfectly understandable and proper explanation, is that the situation in the Middle East is now simply too tense for MBS to feel comfortable about leaving the region. Bear in mind that though President Pezeshkian of Iran will be attending the meeting in Kazan, the actual leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, will remain in Tehran. So you could argue that, given that MBS is the actual ruler of Saudi Arabia, I don't think anybody disputes that anymore, it makes sense that he should stay in Saudi Arabia as well. Saudi Arabia will be represented at a high level at the BRICS summit by its foreign minister, and the fact that it is attending in the way that it is attending, as far as I'm concerned, confirms that it counts itself now as a BRICS state, and that is how it was treated at the news conference. The news conference was very long. Putin fielded all the usual sets of questions from all of these various correspondents. He spoke at great length about many, many topics, including payment systems, BRICS integration, all of those sort of things. He made it very clear that so far as he is concerned, the world is indeed changing and evolving, and that this was a process that certainly might have accelerated as a result of the Ukrainian crisis, but which was already underway beforehand. He also indicated that if countries like Brazil and India and China want to float peace plans for Ukraine, he's absolutely unconcerned about that. He stressed that he has very good relations with the leaders of all of these countries, Xi Jinping, Modi, and Lula. In fact, he referred to them all as his friends. He spoke about the great trust he had for all of these various leaders. But as I said, most of the press conference was not, in fact, taken up with discussions about Ukraine. Most of the discussions were about the development of the BRICS. A certain amount of time was devoted to the Middle East. I'm going to discuss that in my next program. At the very end of this press conference, Putin did start to discuss Ukrainian matters, and I will turn to that shortly. But Putin made it clear that so far as he is concerned, this BRICS summit, the development of BRICS, is the most important event underway in the world at this time. And he is not the only Russian official, to have spoken in that manner. The Speaker of the Federation Council, the upper house of Russia's parliament, Valentina Matvienko, a person who, by the way, I have heard mentioned as a possible successor to Putin, though I think myself that is extremely unlikely. But anyway, she is an important person. She has conducted diplomacy on behalf of the Kremlin, on behalf of Russia, on previous occasions. Anyway, this is what she had to say about BRICS and how important it is. And I quote now, this is taken from TASS. The world has changed significantly. The upcoming US presidential elections will not be the most important event for the year for the world community and will not determine the further course of history. No matter how much Washington would like it to be, the BRICS summit will be that event. And she went on to say that this reflects objective and irreversible processes. I believe that in 2024, the vector of human development will be established in Kazan and not in the wavering United States. The 3 days of the BRICS summit and the negotiations of the leaders of the world majority in the capital of Tatarstan will have a decisive influence on our future. And she went on to say that she believes that truly responsible leaders of sovereign states understand this, and the level of representation at the summit and the ever-growing number of applications for BRICS membership are clear proof of this. I am sure that news from Russia will be followed on all continents, she concluded. So that is, I think, the view in Russia. I think it's the view in many places. I think she is right. That ultimately, what goes on in the United States, who wins the election there, all the present maneuvers that we see taking place in Europe, we'll come to what the Europeans are up to shortly. All of this is ultimately going to appear not perhaps unimportant, but less important. It is going to pale in significance compared to the really important event of this year, which is the meeting in Kazan and the agreements that are going to be made there to advance the BRICS. Now, by the way, Putin and Matvienko talking in this way does suggest that a year of very hard work, in which the Russians have been perhaps most involved, has indeed borne fruit, and that we are going to see significant progress in setting up the BRICS architecture, the messaging systems, the bank messaging systems, the coordinations between central banks, and those sort of things. I ought to say, before I return to Ukrainian matters, that Putin, in his comments, appeared to rule out, however, a common BRICS currency forever, by which I mean that he spoke about, he rejected any concept such as the euro. He said that trying to establish a single currency, which would be equally, which would be legal tender in all BRICS states, that was completely out of the question. What is being discussed and decided upon is instead a new architecture for payments and for trade. And that's what it is. That now brings me back to the situation in Ukraine. And where better to discuss that, to start discussing that question today, than by reference to Putin's comments at this press conference with the BRICS journalists that he has given. Now, fascinatingly and frustratingly, I suspect for many people, especially in the West, Putin only turned to the subject of the Ukrainian conflict at the very end of the press conference. But eventually he did come to discuss this topic. Much of what he said was not new, but he did address some of the points recently made by President Zelensky, specifically the idea that Ukraine might one day soon acquire nuclear weapons, and of course specifically also that article in BILD-Zeitung, which spoke of a Ukrainian official telling BILD-Zeitung that Ukraine could produce a nuclear weapon within just 2 weeks if the Russian army were to return to Kiev. Just to reiterate again points that I made in my program yesterday, after the backlash that Zelensky's actually quite clear words provoked, he backtracked. He said that Ukraine is only thinking about joining NATO. It has no plan or intention for the moment to develop nuclear weapons. That is what he said. And the Ukrainians have categorically denied the story in BILD-Zeitung. However, the journalist who wrote that story, our old friend Julian Röpke, German journalist who covers the Ukrainian war very closely and who has been a committed supporter of Ukraine's cause. Anyway, he then published a message on X in response, in which he reiterated what he was told and said that he stood by his reporting. Now, I have followed Julian Röpke very closely. We fundamentally disagree with each other on pretty much everything there is to say about the Ukrainian conflict, its origins, its the people who are driving it, whatever. But I have mentioned him many times in my programs because I think him an objective and honest reporter. And if he says that a Ukrainian official told him that Ukraine would develop nuclear weapons in about 2 weeks' time, that it has the know-how and the material to do it, then if he says that that was what a Ukrainian official told him, then I have absolutely no doubt at all that it is true. I have confidence in his reporting, and I would say that so should all of us. Anyway, coming back to what Putin had to say about this, I'm going to deal with both the question and answer that he gave over the course of the press conference. And the question was put to him by Dmitry Kiselyov, a very prominent Russian journalist, head of Rossiya Сегодня, the umbrella organization that brings together many of the entities that make up Russia's global media voice, and a very important journalist, somebody taken very seriously in Russia in his own right. Anyway, this is the question that Kiselyov put to Putin. Mr. President, you have mentioned the Ukrainian crisis. Just yesterday, whilst addressing the EU summit in Brussels, President Zelensky, he used ruder words, a ruder word than calling Zelensky president, but anyway, said that the sole alternative to Ukraine joining NATO would be acquiring nuclear weapons. Simultaneously, the Bild newspaper published an interview with some anonymous Ukrainian tech savvy, it's very much Kiselyov's style, by the way, who claimed that Ukraine only needs a few weeks to build its own nuclear weapons and then make a strike at Russian troops. What does it all mean? And then Putin responded in this way. This is yet another act of provocation. In the modern world, creating nuclear weapons is not a difficult task. I said as much in my program yesterday, by the way. I do not know whether Ukraine is capable of doing this now, though. It is not easy for Ukraine today, but generally there are no big difficulties in this regard, with everyone knowing how it is done. This is exactly the point I made in yesterday's program. And then Putin goes on to say this. This is a dangerous act of provocation because obviously any step in this direction will meet an adequate response. This is the second point. And third, most importantly, the current Ukrainian leadership claimed that Ukraine should have nuclear weapons. As I have mentioned on many occasions, they had stated that even before the crisis entered its hot stage. Although it was a soft statement, it was made anyway. And such a threat will elicit a corresponding response from Russia. I can say straight away, under no circumstances will Russia allow this to happen. And then Kiselyov asked him another follow-up question, which was actually, I thought, completely fantastical. This is one of Britain secretly supplying nuclear weapons to Ukraine and then claiming that it was Ukraine that had built them. I don't think there's any possibility of that happening whatsoever, just saying. But anyway, Putin then responded as follows: let's avoid making any hypothetical assumptions and wild guesses about the British or whoever secretly supplying weapons. Such efforts cannot be hidden. They require proper resources and actions. It cannot be done covertly, just as you cannot hide a cat in a bag. And we are capable of tracking any steps in this direction. So it's absolutely clear what Putin said. Now, Alex Christoforou and I on the Duran have covered this whole issue. And Alex Christoforou reminded me over the course of the program that we did, which you can find on the Duran, that one of the reasons why the Russians gave for starting the special military operation was an extraordinarily reckless speech that Zelensky made in February 2022 at the Munich Security Conference, in which he appeared to float the possibility of Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons, a comment which, to the dismay of the Russians, elicited no pushback from any of the Western leaders present. And Putin is now exactly as we discussed in that program on the Duran. Putin is exactly making that very point. He said the third most important point is that the current Ukrainian leadership claimed that Ukraine should have nuclear weapons. As I have mentioned on many occasions, they had stated that even before the crisis entered its hot stage. That is a reference to that speech that Zelensky made at the Munich Security Conference. So the Russians are already extracting political benefits from Zelensky's latest words. Putin is going to be showing all of these words that Zelensky has just used to all of his friends at the BRICS summit meeting, and he will point out to them that when he took the decision back in February 2022 to launch the special military operation, and said that there was at that time a threat that Ukraine might one day acquire nuclear weapons, well, his comments then were received with skepticism, but Zelensky's latest words prove that he was right. So you can already see that Putin, who is nothing if not a consummate politician, is already maneuvering to take advantage of Zelensky's words. And he's saying that the Russians will never allow Ukraine to acquire nuclear weapons. And he's also saying that the Russians are capable of tracking any development or deployment of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, however it is done. He said it is as impossible to hide as it is to hide a cat in a bag. That is what Putin actually went on to say. So there we go. That's Putin on this. He obviously takes Zelensky's words seriously up to a point. He makes the same point that I did, that Ukraine, left to itself, would be able to acquire a nuclear weapons capability if it chose to. It does have the necessary know-how and material. It is no longer such a difficult thing to do. The science is well known, but Russia will never allow it. It has the means to track what is happening in Ukraine, and long before the Ukrainians acquire such a capability, the Russians will act. Now, there's a number of other things I want to say at this point. Firstly, I received a most interesting email from a source. Again, I can't reveal who this source is. This is somebody who's provided me information in confidence before, and I'm not going to reveal his identity. But anyway, this source is the same source that previously pointed out to me that one of the objectives of the Kursk operation, the Kursk offensive, was not just to capture, or not even principally to capture, the Kursk nuclear power plant, but rather to capture the storage facility in the town of Kurchatov, where the Kursk nuclear power plant is located, where tactical nuclear weapons, warheads for tactical nuclear weapons, are housed. And he has said that he previously said the same thing, that the Ukrainians had previously made an attempt to capture a similar storage facility in Belgorod region, and that overall, this whole thing, both the event in Kursk and the event in Belgorod, has about it something of the quality of Ukraine trying to get hold of Russian nuclear weapons, given that it is not apparently able to develop any of its own. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I don't know whether it's possible, if one captures the nuclear weapons of one party, for another party to simply start operating those nuclear weapons. Presumably there are codes and safeguards, which means that if a nuclear weapon were to fall into the wrong hands, it couldn't just be operated by the party that had obtained the nuclear weapon in that way. But of course, there would always be, in that kind of a situation, doubt, and that might be what the Ukrainians would want to play on. And, well, who knows, maybe there are ways of extracting the material from the nuclear weapon and converting it into something else. This source also said that he thought it likely that at some level Ukraine probably has been conducting for some time investigations and researches into acquiring a nuclear weapons capability eventually. Now, as to that, again, I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if it were the case, but certainly the previous one, that the Ukrainians have acted in the past, especially this year, as if they're trying to acquire some kind of nuclear weapons from the Russians, aiming for these storage facilities on Russian territory, or at least create some possible nuclear incident, as seen by the attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and the potential capture of the Kursk nuclear power plant. All of that, I think, there is a significant amount of evidence now to suggest that that is true. And that does reinforce the feeling that in Ukraine, in Kiev, this has become increasingly a primary and obsessive focus. Now, Russian officials have been discussing this possibility, whether Ukraine would be in a position in just a few weeks' time to achieve a nuclear weapons capability. And they are all agreed that in and of itself, that would be impossible. But they do also say, and again, this is what the Russians say, I mean, I'm not in any position to second guess them, but they do also say that whilst Ukraine would not be capable in just a few weeks' time of acquiring a nuclear weapon, in the sense that that is, in the sense of how a nuclear weapon is generally understood, what they could do is develop in a few weeks' time what is called a dirty bomb, which is to say a conventional bomb which is seeded with radioactive nuclear material. And of course, the Russians warned back in the autumn of 2022 that the Ukrainians were working on that possibility, and the Western powers ridiculed that suggestion and in fact turned it round and implied, on the contrary, that it was the Russians who at that time were thinking of using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, with that story subsequently having become, in my opinion, both embellished and exaggerated, and then turned into practically an accepted truth, as has now appeared in Bob Woodward's book. And nobody in the West ever, as far as I can see, took seriously the possibility that the Ukrainians might develop a dirty bomb. Perhaps the Ukrainians have no such plan. Perhaps this is completely what the Russians think, and the Ukrainians wouldn't do it because it's impractical, or because it wouldn't actually change anything significantly on the battlefield. On the other hand, the Russians themselves might believe it, and of course, conceivably, it might be true. Who's to say? Anyway, I am not going to try and venture and pile on my guesses on top of the guesses that others are making. All I would say is that if we are getting into a situation where bombs of that kind get used, well, we are in a very bad place indeed. And the Russians would certainly respond, though not, I suspect, with tactical nuclear weapons. But anyway, there it is. That's what the Russians have been saying amongst each other, and that was Putin's response to Zelensky's latest words. Now, as Putin had an awful lot more to say about the conflict in Ukraine, he dismissed the suggestion that there was any reason to be disappointed with the performance of the Russian army. He said that it would be impossible to set a deadline on when the special military operation would be concluded by. He reiterated again that the only basis for any conceivable settlement between Ukraine and Russia is Istanbul Plus. He went on to say that the Ukrainians have consistently refused negotiations. The Brazilians, the Indians, the Chinese have floated to the Ukrainians the idea of negotiations, and on every occasion the Ukrainians have rejected that idea. Putin also said that the topic of the four regions is not one for discussion anymore. As far as the Russians are concerned, he said it quite straightforwardly, these regions are now Russia. There is nothing, therefore, to talk about with respect to them. The only thing that is relevant now, in terms of Istanbul Plus, are all of the other issues, the issues the issues of disarmament, neutrality, those sort of things, and whether the Ukrainians like it or not, the four regions are no longer an appropriate topic for negotiation. That is consistent, by the way, with Lavrov's recent Newsweek interview, in which he said that the Ukrainians need to accept de jure, formally, that the four regions are Russian territory. Putin didn't quite say that, but by saying that the issue of the status of the four regions is no longer up for negotiation, he strongly implied it, or at least that is my view. So that again further points to a strengthening of the Russian position. Overall, my sense of Putin at this press conference was that he was relaxed and self-confident. He thinks that the situation in Ukraine is going his and Russia's way. He feels, I think, that Zelensky's last few words have played into his hands. It puts him in a stronger position to talk to his BRICS allies about the situation in Ukraine. One reason why he was able to speak about them with such studied courtesy, his BRICS allies. And my overall sense, again, is that for Putin at the present time, what he wants to focus on most is achieving further military gains in the war. The Russians are very close to achieving certain important objectives in the battle in Ukraine. We'll come to all of those in a moment. I think he doesn't want to compromise on any of those. He wants to see all of the important places that the Russians are now attacking firmly under Russian control. I'm not even absolutely certain that he believes any longer in negotiations at all, but certainly he's not willing to shift in any way towards Ukraine. He says Ukraine itself initiated the negotiations that led to Istanbul. That is one could take perhaps certain issue with that, but anyway, that is what Putin said. They initialed the draft agreement in it that was agreed in Istanbul. There is no going back for Ukraine on the concessions Ukraine made in Istanbul. Any negotiations have to be based on that. Zelensky must first of all, before further negotiations can happen, rescind his absurd decree prohibiting himself from further negotiations with Russia. And as far as the Russians are concerned, the four regions are now Russia. So there's nothing further to discuss there. Back in March and April 2022, Donetsk and Lugansk were, as far as the Russians were concerned, independent regions. They were prepared to agree that security guarantees extended to Ukraine would not cover those two regions and Crimea, and that this would be the way of avoiding a final decision on the exact status of these regions, which would be left to subsequent negotiation to take place perhaps in 15 years' time. That was what was discussed in Istanbul. Now, as far as Putin is concerned, the matter is closed. That part of the Istanbul Agreement no longer applies. These regions are Russia, and there is simply nothing more to be said. A position which not only the Ukrainians, but the Western powers are going to find it impossible to accept. So anyway, that was Putin. Those were his statements at the press conference with the journalists from the BRICS states. No doubt there'll be more comments from the Russians over the next couple of days as the ground settles after Zelensky's extraordinary speeches and comments. And in the meantime, the Russians, for their part, look like they're going to focus on the military side of the Ukraine conflict, even as they press forward with the construction of the BRICS. Now, the other side, the United States and its allies, have also been busy. President Biden has been in Europe, and all the indications are, this is my own strong sense, is that what President Biden and his officials are trying to do is that they're trying as hard as they can to put things together in such a way that Ukraine does not collapse whilst whilst President Biden himself is still president. This, I think, is now the administration's priority. They want any collapse, any coming collapse, to be postponed so that it can then be the problem of the president who comes after. There's been much discussion in recent programs, in many places, about a sudden urgency that is coming from the Ukrainians. The fact that they're talking about a timeline of 3 months, that everything has to be wrapped up before the end of the year, within the next 3 months. Many are asking why suddenly this extraordinary urgency from Ukraine. I would suggest that there are two reasons. Firstly, not just the Ukrainians, but the administration in Washington are worried about the stance of any future administration in terms of the war in Ukraine. They want to lock in the American commitment to Ukraine beyond the current administration. And as I said, they don't want Ukraine to collapse on their hands. But on the part of the Ukrainians, they have another further worry. And that comes from the fact that on the battlefields, the situation is not just deteriorating, it is deteriorating fast. We will come to that soon. Ukraine is hardly able to hold back the Russian flood. And I suspect that there is some sort of a calculation in Kiev that unless something is done within the next 3 months, then the cause is well and truly and forever lost, and Ukraine is going to go under. There was an extraordinary interview given by the previous Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, which in its way was almost as bizarre as the latest statements coming from President Zelensky. Poroshenko said that in February 2022, the previous government fled Kiev. The existing Ukrainian government, Zelensky and his officials, fled Kiev. That the entire situation, therefore, devolved upon him. He single-handedly almost held the Russians back, and the fact that Ukraine didn't collapse in the spring of 2022 is in some way down to him. I have to say it was most strange, and it seems to me that it points to Poroshenko, who is certainly very well informed, also becoming increasingly desperate about a situation on the battlefronts, which is now almost out of control, almost out of Ukraine's control. So anyway, this is what the Americans are up to. They're trying to hold things together for 3 or perhaps 4 months until President Biden himself leaves the scene. And they're busy doing all the things that they have consistently done throughout the entire history of this conflict, which is strong arm their European friends to go along with that project. So more attempts to get more money out of Europe. Supposedly, we were told that the Europeans have now agreed between them to advance this €35 billion loan to Ukraine. To repeat again, I don't see how that is possible, given that no European Parliament, so far as I'm aware, has voted on this issue, and I don't think it is possible to make a decision like that without getting the various parliaments of the member states to agree to such a loan. The United States is apparently telling everyone that it is prepared to advance a loan, its own loan, of $20 billion over and above the 35 billion euros that the Europeans are providing. Now note that the $20 billion is higher than the $10 billion that the United States was saying it would provide a few months ago, when the total amount that the Europeans and the Americans and the other G7 states were going to provide to Ukraine was to be $50 billion. So at that time, the Americans were expected to provide around $10 billion, but now suddenly we're told that it's going to be 20. So the Ukrainians are going to get closer to $60 billion from the Americans and the Europeans, rather than the $50 billion that they were promised a couple of months ago. But again, there's been no vote in Congress to authorize this. Speaker Johnson is suggesting that this isn't really something he wants to do. So again, I don't know on what basis the president is actually in a position to promise this. The president, as I rather feared he would, I mentioned the possibility yesterday, is again showing some signs of slipping on his own red lines. He is saying that when it comes to missile strikes, he was captured saying when it comes to deep missile strikes against Russia, well, no one can ever say that their mind is finally and conclusively made up. In politics, everything can change. So he's, again, floating the possibility, as he has done on other occasions, that this plan might be resurrected. I get the sense that the Pentagon is now resolutely opposed, and that key officials in the White House are strongly opposed also. But anyway, the president is now, again, floating that incredibly dangerous possibility. And last but not least, we're getting lots of reports now that the United States and various members of Congress are putting heavy pressure on President Zelensky to lower the conscription age in Ukraine from 25 to 18, to call up teenagers and young men in their early 20s, to bring them into the army, to try to hold the line against the Russians. I have to say, I personally find this one of the most disturbing and troubling things of all. Leaders, political figures in the United States, in Europe, far away from the battlefields, refusing to engage Russia in negotiations, refusing to come up with proposals as to how the war might end, instead trying to strong-arm Ukraine into sacrificing more young lives, more of its youth, in order to delay a defeat which everyone knows is going to happen. It seems utterly chilling to me. Apparently Zelensky, who is aware of the political effect of such a move in Ukraine itself, is resisting this pressure. But the pressure is apparently very strong, and there's even some suggestions that if Ukraine doesn't lower the mobilization age, then Western aid to Ukraine will be withheld. Notice that though there seems to be no intention of pressing forward with Zelensky's victory plan, incredibly dangerous though that is, no one either any longer seems to be discussing peace. The effect of Zelensky's speech is that it has convinced Europeans, if it has done nothing else, and the Americans, if it has done nothing else, that President Zelensky and his government will never enter into negotiations with the Russians, that the idea of a freeze of the conflict is therefore stillborn. It will never happen. That the Ukrainian leadership continues to be completely committed to its maximalist objectives, and that will never change. So rather than reach out to the Russians, try to bypass the Ukrainians to see whether something can be retrieved from this disaster, the Western powers instead are hurriedly putting together, or trying to put together, more arms and financial packages to keep the war going for just a few more weeks, so that the current president of the United States can leave office without a military disaster on his hands, and so that European political leaders can give themselves a few more weeks of life, political life. That, I have to say, is how it seems to me. And it all looks, frankly, awful. So, war goes on. Settlement freeze ideas. Well, the Russians, of course, have already rejected that. That's not up for discussion. The Ukrainians have rejected it anyway. And the Western powers completely refusing to talk to the Russians. As I discussed in a few programs ago, the Russians do seem to have done a gentle reach out to the US embassy in Moscow through the agency of the Izvestia newspaper to see whether the United States might be interested in direct negotiations over Ukraine. But the answer which came back was an emphatic no. So, no negotiations, no real plan about how the situation on the battlefields can be turned, a continuation of the war. No one in the West has any real plan or idea about how to end the war. And in the meantime, more Ukrainian lives are sacrificed, though it's entirely unclear, strategically speaking or geopolitically speaking, to what end? Anyway, there we are. Now, the Kremlin has actually commented on the lack of any real proposal from the West. And this comes from Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. He was talking now about Olaf Scholz. He said, we hear the words, this is Peskov, we hear the words coming from Berlin, Scholz's words about his readiness for dialogue. These are important words because until recently, Germany was one of the countries of the collective West that completely ruled out any contact with President Putin. We said that this position was not constructive. Scholz's current readiness for dialogue is therefore something that we would welcome. Putin was and remains open to dialogue on the settlement in Ukraine. Putin has repeatedly said and confirms that he was and remains open to communications, to talks. At the same time, we, that is to say Russia, have not yet received any real proposals from Germany or other Western countries to organize contacts with President Putin. Whether these statements are backed by actual readiness, whether any initiatives will follow, time will tell. However, no specific proposals on this issue have been made so far. So the Russians wait. They've heard stories that Scholz wants to speak to Putin, but no proposals have been made, no proposals even to set up this phone call. And in light of that, the Russians preserve their continuing skepticism. Again, to repeat once more, Zelensky's speech to the Rada has basically obliterated whatever initiative Olaf Scholz might have entertained. To the best that I can understand, he was trying to get Putin to agree to send a delegation to the peace conference that Zelensky was trying to organize and to agree to a freezing of the conflict. But with Zelensky's effective rejection of negotiations, even Scholz must realize that Putin would never agree to anything like that. And besides, Germany, in the absence of any movement from Ukraine, seems unwilling to move itself. I've said in many places, many times, that this has been the greatest failure of Western policy, certainly in my lifetime, or that I can remember. A situation where all Western policy, all Western diplomatic initiatives are held hostage to the whims of someone like Zelensky seems incredible. It seems astonishing to me that Western governments would have allowed themselves to be maneuvered into that position, but that is where we are. Anyway, there it is. No peace, only war. What is the state of the war? Now, I said that I think that there were reasons to think that there are reasons to think that the crisis on the front lines might be roughly 3 months away by the end of the year. And with every day that passes, I think we get more evidence of this. Before I turn to the actual situation on the battlefield, let me just repeat once again, I've seen lots of stories, I continue to read all sorts of stories about North Korean troops appearing on the Ukrainian battlefields. All sorts of film and pictures of Asian-looking men in Russian uniforms have been cropping up in all sorts of places. We are told, with no authority, that these are pictures of North Korean soldiers. The whole idea of North Korean soldiers fighting in the Ukrainian war seems to me fantastic. The one thing the Russian army isn't short of at the present time, and I think this is a point again to make, is men. Manpower is no longer a problem. The Russians now decisively outnumber the Ukrainians on every battlefront, except perhaps in the very north, in Kursk and Kharkiv, where, to be frank, I don't think the Russians are too bothered if the balance of forces is roughly equal. But in the Donbass battlefronts, the Russians have the enormous advantage. They have the advantage in equipment, in missiles, in shells, in bombs, in electronic warfare, in drones, in every field. 10,000 or 15,000 North Korean troops, which is what people have been talking about, is simply not enough to make a decisive difference in a war where the two armies are numbered in the many multiple hundreds of thousands. And the political damage, the political consequences of having North Korean troops fighting on the Ukrainian battlefields, and the logistical and command problems of having them do so are such that to make the whole thing, from every perspective that I can see, not just pointless, but completely counterproductive. As I said already, there are many nationalities in Russia, especially in Siberia and the Far East, many nationalities where the people have an Asian appearance. This has been always the case. It's absurd to assume that Asian soldiers, Asian-looking soldiers in Russian uniforms are North Koreans. And as I said, I have seen no evidence that there are North Korean troops coming to the battlefronts. And I think for the moment, unless some dramatic new evidence appears, I think we can put that all aside. Anyway, let us now turn finally to the situation on the battlefronts. And lots is going on. The first thing to say is that over the last couple of hours, the Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed that the village of Zoryanye has indeed been captured by the Russians. Now, there's some intrigue here. This is a village northeast of Kurachovo, which forms part of that cluster of villages. Vovchenko, Kurachovka, Alexandropil, the small town of Girnik, Izmailovka, where, as I've said many times, a cauldron appears to be developing. Now, about 10 days ago, the Russians spoke about the capture of a village in this area called Zoryanye Pervi, Zoryanye Pervi, Zoryanye the First, except that no such village appears on any map. There are any map of this area. And there was a lot of confusion. Some suggested that the Russians were confusing, were muddled about the correct name of Zoryanye. Others were saying that there were lots of little settlements that had been consolidated during the period of Ukrainian rule into a single village called Zoryanye. Anyway, there was a lot of confusion and uncertainty about this, especially when it became clear that the Ukrainians were still in control of Zoryanye itself. Some suggested that the Russian Defense Ministry had simply made some kind of mistake. But anyway, today it looks as if this whole debate has become historic, because the Russian Defense Ministry straightforwardly says that Zoryanye, the village which is on the maps, is now under Russian control. And that means that is a sign that the cauldron, the area of the cauldron, is crumbling. The Russians control Ostrivske, Gostye, Zhelanye Pershe, and Zhelanye Druhe, north and east and south of this cauldron. There is now confirmation that there are Russian troops wedged between Izmailivka and Novoselidivka to the west of this cauldron, that the roads in effect have been cut. So we can see that there does appear to be a cauldron, and it is indeed shrinking. So I don't think, as I said, that we are really have any reason anymore to doubt that the situation in this area is indeed becoming critical. Now, I understand that the Ukrainians have now finally acknowledged that the Russians have gained control not just of the village of Sukorinye, further to the north, and the village that is south of Kurakhovo, south of Selidovo, but which is also to the west of this area of this cauldron. I've been sure that Sukorinye is under effective Russian control for some time, though admittedly the Russian Defense Ministry has not confirmed the fact. We have information that the Russians are continuing to advance west of Sukorinye, and that they are in fact very close now to the village of Vishneve, which is west of Selidovo, and there are reports that there's now more fighting going on again in Selidovo itself. Many commentators are saying that Selidovo is already in operational encirclement, and that a cauldron is being created around this particular town, and that several brigades of Ukrainian troops find themselves inside this cauldron, and that in terms of the scale of entrapment of Ukrainian troops, this is the largest potential cauldron up to now of all. Well, that's what people are saying. I see no reason why it should not be true. Meanwhile, further south, after the capture of Maximilianovka, which is, well, I should say the Russians say they've captured Maximilianovka, the Ukrainians still claim that they control some of its western parts. I am sure myself that the Russians do control all of Maximilianovka. After the capture of Maximilianovka and Ostrivske, the Russians are almost on the edge of the urban area of the town of Kurakhovo itself, and they appear to be doing that thing which they always do in these sort of battles, which is that rather than seek to storm Kurakhovo head on, they're now advancing westwards along the southern edge of Kurakhovo, working gradually to cut off the supply roads leading to Kurakhovo itself. So, Kurakhovo, probably in a state of encirclement before very long as well. Well, anyway, we shall see. Now, further south, in the area of Ugledar, north of Ugledar, the 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, the same force that previously defended Novomikhailovka and Konstantinovka and Maximilianovka as well, by the way. Anyway, they have been defending or trying to defend Katerinovka, one of these villages, northeast of Bogoyavlenka. As I said, I've never quite understood the purpose of the Russian advance on these villages. But anyway, the reports, the 79th Brigade is now reporting that Katerinovka, one of the 4 villages, has now been lost, that the Russians have captured it, that the Russians have also probably captured another one of these villages, which is the village of Antonovka, that the 79th Brigade is completely exhausted, that it is no longer able to go on fighting, that they have been repeatedly promised that they would be replaced or rotated, but it has never happened, and that their ability to keep on fighting is running down, and that at least 10 of their soldiers, and this is an elite brigade, have now surrendered to the Russians. So that's the situation on the southern Donbass front lines. In some ways, still perhaps the biggest area of the battlefronts. Elsewhere, it all looks just as bad. The Russians, lots of film now showing the Russians bombing the very northern and western outskirts of Toretsk, strongly suggesting that this is where the fighting for Toretsk has moved to. Obviously, a lot of fighting is still taking place further inside Toretsk in the central areas, but I'm getting the sense that Ukrainian defense inside Toretsk is now deeply fragmented, that the Russians have probably broken up the Ukrainian defenders into isolated units, and some Ukrainian troops in Toretsk are still defending courageously. The days of this battle are ending, and I repeat again, I've heard predictions that the battle for Toretsk could end completely next week, this week that's coming. Anyway, that's Toretsk. And further north, still in Chasov Yar, lots of reports about the Russians storming through the southern parts of Chasov Yar, even as they've been pressing on Chasov Yar in the central area and in the northern parts of Chasov Yar. And, well, it does look as if, just as with Toretsk, Chasov Yar itself is about to fall. The fall of Chasov Yar will mean, by the way, the final end of the single longest battle of the war, which is the Battle of Bakhmut. Chasov Yar, as far as I'm concerned, is very much connected to the fighting around Bakhmut. It was the position from which the Ukrainians conducted their defense of Bakhmut in 2023. Once Chasov Yar falls, the entire Bakhmut area is finally and fully under Russian control. And at that point, the next battle, which will begin, will be the final battle, probably, of the Donbass War, the battle for the conurbation of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka, which are the only important towns left in the northwest of Donbass, still under Ukrainian control. There's been no news that I'm aware of from the Seversk area. There continues, however, to be many reports of heavy fighting in the village of Torske on the Zherebets River. As I said, the Russians now very close, as far as I can see, to completely clearing the east banks of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers. And the distance from Torske to Liman looks quite small, with other places further north, Makeyevka, Nevska, now under Russian control. It's likely that places like Terny, Yampolivka, and Yampil will also fall to the Russians fairly soon. Siversk, at that point, will probably become undefendable. The Russians will be then in a position to cross the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. Liman itself could be recaptured, and then the Russians will be close to Slavyansk. Very, very close again to Slavyansk. And of course, if they start their offensive further north and aim to recapture Kupiansk, which everyone expects they will, and ultimately Izium and Balakleya also, then Slavyansk would also be surrounded from the north as well. And this time, the Russians would be there in force, not as they were in 2022, and they would outnumber the Ukrainians massively. And at that point, when the Russian siege of Slavyansk begins, it will be impossible to hold back the Russians, even if the process of capturing Slavyansk is likely to take several months. Anyway, there we are. That's the situation in that part of the front line. Now, the most dramatic news continues to come from the Kursk area. There are now lots of reports that the village of Plekhovo, south of Suja, has fallen, that the Russians have captured this village. There's been no confirmation of this so far from the Russian Defense Ministry or from Group of Forces North, but it may be true. The Russians are claiming that they have now created another cauldron of Ukrainian troops in the area north of Malaya Lochnia. We'll see. I spoke yesterday about these very distressing pictures of Ukrainian troops fleeing from Lyubimovka across the fields, pursued by Russian drones and then shelled by Russian mortars and multiple launch rocket systems. The latest reports say that the Ukrainians are desperately, I think desperate is the right word, hurriedly, if you prefer, trying to build fortifications in Suja itself. The logic of trying to defend somewhere like Suja seems to me to be, well, I cannot see it. I would have thought far more logical to withdraw from there. But anyway, that is what the Ukrainians are doing. And everywhere, Ukraine continues to lose men, machines. The situation with the energy system remains dire. The economy is, has, to all intents and purposes, ceased to function. It's not surprising that people like Zelensky and Poroshenko are becoming desperate and are retreating increasingly to what I can only consider a fantasy world in which Ukraine suddenly turns the tables through some kind of brilliant diplomatic maneuver, or by acquiring nuclear weapons, or by launching a deep strike into Russia, or through some means of getting Western boots on the ground in Ukraine. To repeat again, these are all fantasies, but the fact that the Ukrainian leadership is retreating into fantasy is a sign that they are not accepting reality. And it is a fact of staggering political failure that Western governments, so invested in this project, are allowing themselves to be held hostage to these fantasies rather than themselves confront the reality of the situation by trying in some way, in whatever way they can, to achieve peace. Anyway, that's the situation today, as far as I can see it. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also find our work. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Don't forget also that you can don't forget also that if you've liked this video, you can tick the like button, and don't also forget to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.